Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Alfonso Peluso and I'm a Studio Associate Professor in the College of Architecture at IIT, the birthplace of modern architecture. Today I'd like to continue on my series, What is Grasshopper Good For? Also, I received a request from one of my subscribers, username Film Factory. Thank you for your input. And Film Factory has requested that I go over the most used Grasshopper commands. And I plan to incorporate that into my next several videos. And today, some of those most used Grasshopper commands will be array, move, copy, and extrude. So I'm going to tie that into looking at what is Grasshopper good for. And in my last video, we looked at this concept of generating multiple values. And I think that's a real important concept when learning Grasshopper or looking at what is Grasshopper good for. It also helps develop a very strong foundation that's going to really help you moving forward. So today you see a list of topics that I'm going to look at. What is Grasshopper good for? Continue with this series of looking at generating multiple values. We're going to look at how we can generate multiple values using a number slider, using a series, using a range, using a domain, using random, and using graph mapper. Now, the array is a great place to start at looking at generating multiple values and how that affects the array. Now, an array is simply a copy of multiple objects. So if we look at Santiago Calatrava's promenade for the 2004 Olympics in Athens, and I actually visited this a few years after the Olympics, and unfortunately it's abandoned, but it's actually kind of neat to walk through. It's like an architectural graveyard, so to speak. And I love Santiago Calatrava. He's one of my favorite architects. But looking at his work, if you're looking for case studies, look at Calatrava, because this is a great place if you're getting your feet wet with Grasshopper. Start modeling some of his buildings. They look very complex at first, but when you look a little bit closer, you see it's just a lot of one element copied many times. So here you see this main arch, which is arrayed along a path, and that path happens to be an arc. And between those main arches, you see these diagonal lines. So we not only have an array of the large arc spanning from one side to the other, we have an array of these diagonal members. So you'll see that a lot in Santiago Calatrava's work, and Grasshopper is really good at creating arrays in multiple arrays. So let's jump into Grasshopper and look at how one might make an array. So as I go through these topics, I have these little definitions. So we're going to start with the array. And as I mentioned, array, copy an object multiple times in a specified direction with a specified distance between each object. The distance is uniform, and we're going to talk about that a lot today, generating multiple values. You're going to hear me say that a lot, and you're going to wonder why is Alfonso stressing the importance of multiple values? And the reason I stress that is that what generating multiple values is what allows you to iterate your design, to see multiple iterations, multiple options. So we'll continue with that. Okay, an array. So I'm just going to choose, I'm just going to double click and type in box, and many ways to make a box. I'm going to use a center box. And for the size, I'm going to use 2. Not really that important what the size is for now. I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. Okay, so we see this box. Now if I want to make an array, which means to copy an object multiple times in a specified direction with a specified distance between each object, I'm going to use an array capsule, and there's many types of arrays. There was a time in Grasshopper when array didn't exist. You had to use a move, and a move is a copy, and then you would use things like things that we're going to cover today. But now Grasshopper has made that easy for us. So we have a rectangular array. What were some of the other types of arrays we have? We have a linear array. So a few different options you have for an array. For today's tutorial, let's look closer at the linear array. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. Okay, and it needs a direction, so that's what I mentioned in the definition, a specified direction. So let's just go ahead and use the x-axis. So I'm going to go ahead and plug that in, and so that's a specified direction. Now we need a specified distance between each object. So that specified distance will get plugged into the direction. So this box is 2 in the x, the y, and the z. So I need a number greater than that. I'm going to start with a distance of 6. Go ahead and plug that in. Okay, and then count. Now, a lot of capsules in Grasshopper have default inputs. So when I hover over that count, you see there is already a value of 10 plugged into that. So I'm going to double click and type in 5. Okay, so there is my array. Okay, I have a total of 5 objects. That's what this equals, and their distance apart is 6. Okay. Now the distance is uniform. Again, I know I mentioned that already in this video, but I just want to stress that the spacing between the objects is uniform. Okay, so let's look at making an array where the distance is not uniform, and we're going to do that using number sliders. Okay, so I'm going to take this and unplug it from the array. So I'm doing that with the Alt key is the way that I'm unplugging it. And it doesn't matter which direction I do this, but I'm holding down my Alt key to unplug that. Sorry, it's my control key. So it is the control key. I thought that was pretty interesting with the Alt key, though. I haven't seen that with the red dashed line. I'm guessing that's maybe an error. I love to learn new things. Okay, so we're going to take this box now. We'll leave this array behind, and we're going to use a move. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial talking about most used commands. Today we're looking at array. We're looking at move. Now move is a copy. That's the way move works in Grasshopper, because Grasshopper is always keeping a history of what you do. That's one big part, or one big idea or concept of parametric modeling, is you have a history. So I have my original box, and then I'm going to plug that into my move, and you see immediately in the viewport that that is creating a copy. Okay, now I need to specify which direction I'm going to make that copy. By default, I hovered over the motion, and I'm seeing that the Z is already set to 10. So it's moved itself 10 units. I think in this case I'm working in inches, so it's moved it 10 inches in the Z direction. So just to mimic what we did above with the array, we're going to copy that in the X direction. and we're going to specify a distance, and I'll just keep that same distance that we had before, which was 5. Okay, so we've made one copy. Now I can continue to use my number slider. Okay, so for example, if I type in 10, now I have one that's copied 10 feet apart, or I'm sorry, in this case 10 inches. I can do 15, and I can do 20, and I can do 25. Okay. So in one of my videos, Intro to Grasshopper, I looked at Mr. Sparkle, where you could use Mr. Sparkle to align your number slider. So looking at better organization of your Grasshopper definition. So I've selected all those number sliders. This is my Mr. Sparkle. If I click on that left arrow, it left justifies those number sliders. Okay, so now we've essentially created an array that's identical to what we had before. And you would say, well, why would we do this? We have the array. What I can do now is I can create values that where I'm varying the spacing between these. So this one might only be copied over 4, and this one might be 9, and this one is a little bit further, and this one is a little bit further yet, and so on. So now my array is not uniform. It's non-uniform. With which, we looked at Santiago Calatrava and everything was very uniform, but with more architects looking at parametric modeling and designing with parametric modeling, you're actually seeing a paradigm shift in how, let's just use array, how we're seeing the array used in architectural design. So looking at generating multiple values that are non-uniform. So we've done that there with a number slider. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is a series. So we'll pull this down. Okay, so a series is another way to generate multiple values. So let's go ahead and look at that. So I'm going to take this box again, and I'm going to unplug it, and this time I'll use the control versus the alt. And we're going to take that and bring it down under our series. Okay, so let's look at the array again, and then we'll move into extrude. So I'm going to use the copy again. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. I'm going to plug that in. Okay, I'm going to unplug this motion. Okay, so we're gonna do this in the X direction again, and we're going to use a series to create our 5 values. We've been creating 5 boxes in our array, so we're going to use a series to do this. So I'm going to double click, and I'm going to bring out the series capsule. Okay, so now that we have a series capsule in front of us, we can start to talk about these inputs. So it's a series, and our first input is start. So start equals a value to start with. That value could be 0. It doesn't have to be. It could be, that value could be, let's say we're going to start at 6. Okay, we'll go ahead and plug that in. The next one is our step. Step equals a value to count by. That's one way to look at it. Or I guess if we talk about a value to count by, that's 2, 4, 6, 8 if you're counting by twos, or it could be the distance between the boxes. So we're going to use 6 again, so that the boxes are 6 inches apart in this case, because the units are set to inches. And then you see a whole bunch of these. There's probably 10 of them there, because when I hover over the input for count, it has a default of 10. And just to match the other two arrays that we looked at, we had a count of 5. Now what I haven't looked at yet in this tutorial, which is important, is looking at the values that are being generated. So one of our best friends in Grasshopper is the panel. So I'm going to bring down a panel, and what the panel does is it lets us see the values that are generated, especially when we're looking at generating multiple values. So here we can see these. Now at this point they're being shown to us as X, Y, and Z. So you see the X value is changing. It started at 6, and then it's counting by 6. So 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30. And if I add a panel back here after my series where those multiple values were being generated, you could see those. So lots of different applications for generating multiple values. Here, our multiple values 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30 ended up being used as the X value, looking at our Cartesian grid X, Y, Z. Okay, next topic. Okay, so let's look at using a range. Now range and domain, these go together. So I'm going to take both of these with me if Grasshopper is going to be kind enough to let me do that. There we go. Alright. Okay, so let's make this a little bit more interesting. Okay, so this time instead of working with the boxes, I'm gonna work with a rectangle. So I'm just gonna take everything above here, select it, right click in the canvas, and choose preview off. So my screen is now blank. And I'm gonna start with a rectangle. Start by making a rectangle. And just as with the box, okay, so this is something I think is worth looking at, and I don't hear too many people talking about this with the rectangle. So when you look at this rectangle that was created, it's not a square. I end up turning my rectangles into squares a lot of times. But what I want to focus on right now is this rectangle is its origin is the center of the rectangle. And if let's say I was to plug in a number slider 2 for the X, it then moves the origin to 0. Okay, so I'm going to bring out, just to see this, bring out another number slider set to 2. Now the origin is 0, 0, 0, the origin of Rhino. But I liked that it was centered. So what was happening there? So I'm going to go ahead and delete these. Goes back to being centered. So what's happening is the default, when I hover over the X, it is using a domain. A domain, as you see here, defines the minimum and maximum values. So there was a negative value from -1 to 1, from -2 to 2. So I can set these. I can right click and go to set domain, and I could put this, I can set this from -2 to 2, and that continues, or not continues, but the square that's going to be generated will have an origin of 0, 0, 0. and that I like. I'm actually going to bake that rectangle or square into Rhino. Then I can use my zoom scale. ZS for zoom scale now allows me, like if you're having trouble orbiting or panning and zooming due to scale issues in Rhino, you can always select an object, type in ZS, and now it's using that when you 3D orbit, pan, or scale. It's using that as a center point. Okay, so we have our rectangle. I could extract those as well. So you saw me right click on that and choose extract parameter, and that just in this case shows me that domain. I could use a domain capsule, which we're going to get to in a second here. So go ahead and move these over. Okay, so let's go ahead and array this in the X direction. So I can do this by using a range, but I would like to use my range for my extrusion values so that we move a little bit further beyond the array. So for right now, I can take some capsules rather from above and just copy and paste them down to this part of our definition and change the geometry that I'm arraying from the box above to the rectangle that I just created. So I'll go ahead and plug that in. Now this capsule is off. Okay, the preview is off. That's why I'm not seeing anything here, and that's also one of the reasons why I've changed the color of my hidden capsules to this magenta. I covered this in my intro to Grasshopper videos, and I'll put some links. I've mentioned at least a couple videos that I've covered things before, and I'll put some links at the end of this video so you can see those and take a look at those. But if I use my shortcut Shift Control P in Grasshopper, Shift Control P brings up the Grasshopper settings, and under palette I've set the hidden capsule fill color to this magenta color. So that just is an alert to me that, hey, that capsule's off. That's why you're not seeing anything. So I can select it, right click, and turn preview on. Okay, so now we're seeing that array. Okay. So let's look at this range. We're going to look at it using an extrude. So let's say I want to add or turn rectangles, turn a 2D object into 3D. That's basically what an extrude does, and a use for an extrude. So I can double click and type in extrude, and I'm extruding those rectangles. So that's what base typically stands for. Now, one of the challenging things with Grasshopper is the input terms are not always consistent. Maybe one day they will be, but at the moment they're not always consistent. For example, this input on our move capsule says geometry, and then when I hover over it, it says base geometry. What am I moving? This is also base. That could be base geometry. So just something that you'll get used to. Just remember that. Don't fault yourself. The input terms are not always consistent. Okay, so with my extrude, it would like a direction for that extrusion. I'm going to do that. I'm going to extrude that in the Z. Now, the extrude does not, you'll see that right off the bat, it's not default that it caps those. Okay, we can add a cap holes to that so we get those to be solid boxes like we had before. Okay, so that's another topic that we're going to talk about in future videos. What's the most efficient way to do things? A lot of times students or people new to Grasshopper, they look at their definition at the end, they stare at their definition, and they say, wow, there had to be a better way to do that, or there had to be an easier way to do that. Don't get caught up on that. That comes in time. Okay, there's always better ways to do things. As long as your end result is what you want, that's what's important for now. Okay, so let's continue with this idea of generating multiple values, but let's look at it now using the extrusion, because at the moment there's a default of 1 that's plugged into the z vector. So we can use what we've learned above. We could use, okay, if we look at this, we could use a series to create multiple values for those extrusions. We could use a bunch of number sliders, or we could look at something new, which is called a range. So let's go ahead and bring that capsule out. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and bring these two definitions down here by our range. Okay, so you see here I'm getting a red capsule here. That's because it doesn't have enough input at the moment. Okay, so the range. One of the inputs is domain. Domain is how you define the minimum and max values. Then it has steps. Define the number of values. And then there's a +1 involved. And then I've put some asterisks here. Beware of the +1. And we'll look more at that in a second. Now the range also creates uniform values as opposed to non-uniform values. I'm guessing the reason why I'm getting an error on the extrude is we have a value in here of 0. So this is really important. When things go wrong, when you see a capsule in red, or you see things not working the way that you think they should be working, this is when you pull out your best friend. You pull out the panel and you look at what's happening here. Okay. So you see here that there is, and I like to extend these, and I like to get each line item. So sometimes I need to extend them vertically, but sometimes I need to extend them horizontally depending on what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm sure that's why the extrusion is giving me red, because we have an extrusion height of 0. Okay, so try to mimic some of the things that we just did. So the domain. So I'm going to double click and bring out my domain. It's actually a construct domain. Okay, there's a few of these, and this is not the construct domain squared. It's the icon that's 0 to 1. Create a numeric domain from 2 numeric extremes. So it's minimum and maximum is what it is. Okay, so let's say that we want a minimum extrusion of 1. And we want a maximum of extrusion. I'm going to double click and type 15 because it's more than 10, and that will give me a number slider that goes beyond 10. So here we see from 1 to 15. And let's look at our panel. Now we only have 5 extrusions, but we have 10 values. So that's important. We want to make sure that we only have 5 values, 1 for each one of the extrusions. So we're going to put in 5. So this is another place where there's some, I guess, just getting used to the input terms, and not those input terms not being consistent, because we can think of steps here. We can think of that as our count, or better yet, what I've defined here defines the number of values plus 1. Okay, so we will see here, if we zoom in closer, that there's actually 2 extrusions at the same place. There's the 12.2 extrusion height and the 15 extrusion height. That's because we have more than 5 values. Remember, Grasshopper starts counting at 0, so we actually have 6 values here. So this is where this is why I've used the asterisks. Beware of the +1. Okay, so what we have to do, range, it's just that range capsule adds a +1. That's just the algorithm that's in there. That's the script. Remember, Grasshopper is a visual scripting software, so that's the script that's in there. So I can solve that by right-clicking. I'm right-clicking over the input steps, and I can go down to expression, and I'm going to type in x minus 1. And then you get this little expression icon. So if you're looking online and you're looking at definitions or people doing tutorials and you see that asterisk, that means there's an expression in there. And what I usually do is, again, when you work with Grasshopper, you want to leave notes for your future self. So when you come back and look at that definition, what is that expression? Well, I can use a scribble and I can say x minus 1. And I can just put that there. So I know here's my expression icon, and then that's what's in that expression. Now I have 5 values again. So we're using our range. So range is different than a series, because what range does is you're setting the minimum max and telling it how many values, and Grasshopper calculates the values in between. Okay, so you're not counting by 5s, or you're not counting by 2s, or counting by 6. You're setting a minimum and maximum, and you're dividing that minimum max into a number of values. Okay, so that's range and domain. Okay, so next up here, we have random and graph mapper left. I think graph mapper is probably the coolest and most effective, so I'll save that one for last. We'll look at random. So what I like about these two also, graph mapper and random, is now we're getting into non-uniform values, and we've only done that once in this tutorial, and that was using multiple number sliders, which seems like a basic technique, but still effective in creating non-uniform values. So let's go ahead and look at random. And okay, so right now when we looked at range, we looked at it for our values for our extrusion. Okay, so we can do that with random. Let's pull out our random. Now this icon, I love this icon. So if you could guess what that icon, I mentioned David Rutten, the guy who created Grasshopper. He definitely has a sense of humor. So if you could guess what David Rutten is referring to, maybe it's not funny, but I find it humorous. But if you can guess what he's referring to, please go ahead and leave it in the comments. Let's see who gets that one first, what he's referring to. Okay, so you see this random capsule, and you see it's actually has an input that says that is range. So again, with the input terms not always being consistent, you might go ahead and grab a range capsule and try to use that. But it's actually looking for a domain. So it says domain of random numeric range. So we have already set that up once before, and we'll do it again for graph mapper. So I can take that domain, and I'm going to start to drag it down, and I'm going to introduce my alt key. So that's another way to do a copy and paste, essentially, is you start to drag, and then you press down the alt key. And I'm going to plug that into the range. So let's start to see these values right away. So we'll grab our best friend, the panel, and we'll plug this in, and we're going to start to see this. Okay, so we're just getting one number for right now, which I'm actually shocked that that's the default, even though I've used this capsule many times. So I hover over that, and you see there's only one value. We've been generating 5 values because we need one for each one of the rectangles that we're extruding. So I can double click and type in 5, and I'll go ahead and plug that in. So you see now I have 5 random values. Okay, so the range use a domain to define the min and max values. The number define the number of values. We have 5, and then seed shuffles the order of the values. Okay, so we'll plug. I'll just look at shuffling it between, say 0 and 10 times. So I can go ahead and shuffle that. You see those numbers shuffling around. And we're going to plug this now into where our extrusion is happening above. So we're going to remove the range. We're going to take the range out of the equation. So now I would love to be able to plug these panels directly in. Okay? It works here. But I need to warn you that it doesn't always work. These panels, you'll definitely run into a situation where it doesn't work. So I'm just alerting you ahead of time now that the panels are not always perfect path-throughs. You can't always plug those in. In this case, it worked great. We're using that. Okay, so you see the extrusion, and now we can create non-uniform values. Basically, they're non-uniform at the moment, meaning they're shifting. Okay, and we can use this as design iteration. So we can move this around, and we see those changing. Okay, so let's look at our last type, our last way to create multiple values, and this time we're going to use a graph mapper. So let's bring that down, and again we're going to do this. For the extrusion. So let's pull out a graph mapper. So I'm going to double click and type in graph, and I'm going to choose graph mapper. And then this is where Grasshopper just leaves you in the dark. You type in graph mapper, you place it in, and you just have this empty square. In my case, it's magenta because it's a hidden capsule in a sense. So when you see my number sliders are magenta, it's because they don't preview any geometry in the Rhino window. So any of the capsules that don't preview any geometry are going to be set to your hidden fill color. So for you guys, it's a darker gray, just a shade darker than the standard default gray. So that's why I change it, because it's hard to tell which capsules are hidden. Okay, so let's look at this. It leaves you in the dark here, but a graph mapper requires a domain and a range. The domain of the graph mapper must equal the domain plugged into the range. That's super important, and we'll get to that in a second. So this requires a domain and a range. So we have that already. Let's just take this, and actually we'll take the whole thing. Okay, we need all this. We need a domain, a range, and actually, sorry, this is our random. So our domain and range is above here. So let's take all of this, start to drag it, hold down the Alt key. We'll bring this down. Okay. So I don't want to plug this in right away, because I want us to see how this works from beginning to end. So we'll get our best friend the panel, and we're going to plug that in. Okay. No data, we assume that. So let's look a little closer at the graph mapper. We're going to right click, and we're going to go down the graph types, and you see there's a whole bunch of different graph types, and we'll just look at a couple. Once you learn the basics of how to use the graph mapper, it doesn't really matter what graph type you use. They all work much in the same way. So we're going to choose I'm going to choose sign to start with. Okay, still no data collected. Okay, so that's because it requires a domain and a range, which we already have over here. So we're going to plug that in. Okay, now we're getting some values here. Now these values, they're not matching our domain, and that's important because we want specific values. We want minimum and maximum, let's say from 1 to 15, and we're not seeing that here. So that's why we're seeing values between 0 and 1. Okay, starting out with 1 and then decreasing to 0 and then increasing back to 1. So what's happening here is our domain of the graph mapper does not equal the domain that's plugged into the range. So we have to double click on the graph mapper, and we have two domains. We have a minimum and maximum for x, so that's what domain is, minimum, maximum. We have a minimum and maximum for x, and we have a minimum and maximum for y. So I'm going to set both of those maximums to 15. Actually, we're using a domain between 1 and 15 right now. So there's 1 and 15 in the x, and here's 1 and 15 in the y. Okay, so now we're getting these values between 1 and 15. Now this one's a little harder to figure out what it's going to look like until we plug it in. Let's see if we can plug our panel directly in. I think I'm going to go ahead and move. Okay, so that's working. I'm going to go ahead and move these down, just where we're working for now. You guys know I hate when wires cross through, because then you guys can't see what I'm doing. Okay. Alright, so that's better. We can see what's happening here. So so now what I love this capsule because now I can use it visually. Okay, so you see that's pretty cool there. I'm using that and I'm getting that to update. Okay, so my extrusion heights are looking, you know, we only have 5 objects right now, so it's a little tricky, but they're starting to look like our graph mapper, and changing some of these values could help with that as well. Maybe something in here that's not set to 1, or something that gives me some flexibility here. Okay, so let's look at these. Let's try to make this a little bit more clear. But you see, I'm using a sine wave here. I'm going to use a custom preview. Okay, I'm going to use a custom preview. I'm going to plug that in, and you see it's just right off the bat. It's a little easier to see what's happening in the Rhino window, and I can use a color. And David Rutten is spelling color like I guess like the Europeans might say it, or the British, or maybe the Canadians. You guys could probably correct me if I'm wrong on that. But he's using COLOUR, and there is a color swatch, and I could plug that in. Okay, and then I could change the color of that. Okay, so just a little easier to see there. Okay, so back to the graph mapper. So it has these grips, so I can, and you'll see this being updated in the panel here. Okay, so as I raise and lower these, okay, you see the values changing in that panel. And as I move this over, Okay, so I really like this in terms of, right now we're just arraying some squares, but you can start to imagine on buildings and the amazing geometry that we can create with Grasshopper if you start to use Graph Mapper as this visual way to generate multiple values. You can create some great things. Whether this is plugged into. Remember, this Graph Mapper can be applied to so many things. I think that's what's so important about this concept of generating multiple values. Here we're looking at applying it to an extruding, but uh, I'm sure you're probably sick of hearing it by now in this tutorial, but just trying to drive it home that at the end of the day you can generate multiple values, and that can be used for anything from arrays to extrusions to the opening of a window or an oculi in a building. So a bunch of different graph types there. One that I like to use a lot is the Gaussian, because it's increasing and decreasing values. So you have to get in here and get comfortable with this a little bit. So let's look at this. Let's get this to display properly here. Okay, so this is where I'm not seeing the result that I want because I'm not seeing the decreasing. So let's bring this down. Let's bring these together a little bit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this panel out of the way. Okay, so that's not the issue. Let's see where I'm having the issues. Let's get some more drastic values in here. Let's shift this a little bit over. Okay, so here you see this now. Where that value is, I think is really great. So as I move this to the left, and it's applying it to the next one, and then the next one, and I don't have enough room in here. Okay. So let's have too much in between these. So this number, get this number a little bit higher. Okay, and there's other graph types that you can look at within here. So I invite you to experiment with those. Okay, so I want to thank you guys for tuning back into my channel, and you're going to see in the upper left my face is going to pop up, and if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face. I'm going to put a link to a few of the videos and some others that I've talked about during this tutorial. Go ahead and follow me on Instagram and see what I'm up to. And I really appreciate you tuning back in. And if you find this video helpful, give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to leave some comments below on what you'd like to see in some future videos. See you next time.